Hey Wolfpack, and welcome back. I hope you all are doing well, and I hope you all had a very creepy week. Today, we're doing 3 more camping stories. Now, I know I haven't done any more camping stories since last year in December, so I'm finally back with more, but this time, I'm back with more characters. Tonight, we are with Penny Tails Up, Max Paranormal, and Night Shift Runations. All of their channels will be linked down below, and they will more than likely be in my channel more often to feature characters later on. So, with that said, whether you're sitting around a campfire, on the night shift, or even laying in bed, let my voice soothe your nightmares.
Ethan,
I heard my mom shout from downstairs.
it's time to get up. We gotta go.
I tossed and turned in bed, groggy with just barely enough energy to lift my eyelids a sliver. Daylight poured through my bedroom window and reflexively made me shut my eyes again.
Ethan, we need to go. Now.
My mom shouted more empathetically this time. Coming! I hollered back as I rolled out of bed and trekked to the bathroom. I grabbed my toothbrush and squirted some toothpaste on the end. As I brushed, I looked at myself in the mirror. I looked like a real mess. Hair going every which way, eyes barely open and crusted on both sides. I stumbled over to the shower and got the water started. What was the point of showering the day of camp anyway? I'd just get all gross again. I quickly finished my shower, threw some clothes on, and ran downstairs.
We're going to be late. We're going to be so late. I hope they don't leave without you.
My mom said in a disapproving tone.
The car's packed. We just need to go.
Okay, I said as I hurried at the door to the car. 7:59 a.m. We got to my school just in time. My mom yelled, "Goodbye!" and "I love you!" out the window as I sprinted to the chaperone of my group.
Ethan, you sure know how to make loading a bus suspenseful.
Mrs. Twinkle grumbled as she peered over her glasses at me. I hopped on the bus and sat next to my friend Dave, who was still saving a seat for me with his backpack, knowing I'd be late. The 3-hour bus ride was uneventful, and flew by as Dave and I talked about what the next 2 weeks would be like. Every summer since we were in 1st grade, we'd gone on this camping trip together. This year, though, we'd have more freedom to do the activities we wanted, mostly on our own, too. Pulling up to Camp Widowy, we felt more nostalgic every year than prior. The smell of pine trees, the sound of rushing rivers, all the memories of past summers came flooding back. We unloaded the bus and carried our bags to the cabins. The boys all slept in 2 large cabins on one side of the dusty dirt path leading through the campgrounds, while the girls had 2 cabins on the other side. Dave and I headed into our cabin along with a bunch of the other guys. Dave and I claimed our usual bunk and threw our bags on the beds. After everyone grabbed a bed, we all lined up outside for the introduction and usual safety talk. I've heard this talk so many times, I could probably give it myself though. Blah blah buddy system, blah blah fire safety, new summer, same lame speech. I looked around at the other guys, and they looked bored as hell too. All the usual guys were there though. Austin, Tyler, Manson. We'd grown pretty close over the years. Tommy, Zach, and Kevin. We'd had so many fun times here. Jack, Jesse, and the new kid in school, Lucas. I heard he just moved here last month from somewhere down south. He seemed like a nice enough guy. After a long spiel, we all got together to catch up. It'd only been 2 weeks since school let out, but we still felt like we needed to fill each other in on any other recent events. Our lives as junior high schoolers were fast-paced, you know? I could tell Lucas felt a bit out of place, so I cut into the rapid-fire discussion. "Hey, you're Lucas, right?" I said to try to get him into the conversation. Lucas looked over at me as everyone else grew silent. His eyes were an icy electric blue that almost seemed to glow as I looked into them. They were the most mesmerizing eyes I'd probably ever seen, Lucas smiled at everyone and introduced himself.
Yeah, I'm Lucas. My friends back home call me Luke. I know I don't really know you guys and you don't know me, but I was hoping this trip would help me make some friends before school starts,
he said, his voice growing more confident as he spoke. Everyone peppered Luke with questions. Where are you from? What's it like there? Are the girls really hotter? What do you like to do? Luke happily answered all the questions we threw at him. We went to the mess hall for lunch and continued talking and getting to know Luke. After lunch, we headed back to our cabins to get changed for our first hike. Luke had the bunk right across from mine. We chatted for a bit before heading outside to join the rest of the group. The hike was incredible. We reached the top of the mountain just as the sun was dipping below the horizon. What a gorgeous view it was. We started a fire and roasted marshmallows before heading back down the mountain. Everyone had their flashlights and headlamps on. Our one leader led the way while the other took up the rear. We were about halfway down when I heard it. Someone from our group screamed at the top of their lungs in agony. We all looked around as our leaders rushed towards the scream. Being curious and scared kids, we followed our leaders to Jack. He was lying on the ground with 2 puncture wounds in his left leg, right above his ankle. Luke was sitting right beside him, trying to keep him calm. Jack's wounds started to swell and redden as we watched our leaders care for him. What happened? Our one leader asked Jack.
I don't know. I stepped off a rock that felt a sharp pain, like a bite,
Jack said shakily. Luke chimed in.
I think I saw a snake slither by after he screamed.
Did you see what kind? The other leader asked.
I don't really know. It was black and red, maybe some yellow.
Luke answered. Crap, that might be venomous. Let's get him down into a hospital, the other leader said. The leaders lifted Jack up and carried him down the rest of the way. When we reached the bottom, an ambulance was waiting for Jack. All of those hikes we'd done in the past, we never had a snake encounter. I didn't even know that mountain had snakes. As we turned in for the night, we were all worried about Jack. It was tough to fall asleep, so we all stayed up talking and joking around. Zach and Jesse wanted to start a Truth or Dare game, so that helped us get through an hour or two before we heard a knock on our cabin, and it startled us. It was after 11 p.m. according to my watch. The door creaked open, and our leader came in looking exhausted. I have some news on Jack. First off, he's going to be fine. They gave him some anti-venom at the hospital. Luke's description helped a lot, I'm told. Jack should be back in a day or two. Our leader rambled off. I gotta say, first snakebite I've seen in those mountains, but glad he's gonna be okay. Hopefully you boys can get some rest. With that, he exited our cabin, closing the door behind him. Aside from that crazy night, the first week was rather uneventful. We did everything from archery to fishing. It was the second week that was unusual, to say the least. Monday night, my friends Kevin and Manson talked about going to a sunrise hike and asked if I wanted to join them. I was feeling more in the mood to kayak that day, so I declined their offer. Luke said he'd go with them though. I spent the day on the lake kayaking with a few other guys and girls. We headed back to the shore just before dinner. We walked as a group to the mess hall, ready for a well-deserved dinner. When we walked in, everyone seemed to be in a frenzy. Everyone was talking about something. Was it Jack? He was back already. That wasn't it. I sat down and asked someone what was going on.
You haven't heard? Kevin slipped and fell off the mountaintop. He must have stepped on a loose rock or something, but he went over the side and landed on a ledge like 10 or 15 feet below. And thank God for that too. Or else, well, you know.
He paused.
They took him away like an hour ago. Surprised you didn't see the flashing lights.
I sat there stunned. Camp was always fun, but painfully uneventful. Well, except for the occasional pranks and crazy Truth or Dare games. Nothing like this has ever happened before. How'd he get down from the mountain? I blurted out. Well, Manson was way ahead of them. He said he heard someone shouting for help and ran back. Luke was already lowering himself down to the ledge on a rope that I guess he packed. He recounted. I was a little confused, but let him continue. Manson says Luke lifted Kevin onto his shoulder and climbed back up where they waited for help. I thanked him for filling me in and got up to go get some food. Meatloaf tonight. Not my favorite, but I wasn't exactly hungry anymore. I grabbed my tray and looked around the mess hall. I caught Luke's eyes from a distance and saw a group gathered around him, presumably trying to get all the details. Luke rolled his eyes as people continued to crowd around him. I walked over and joined them, making my way through the crowd. I set my tray down next to Luke and tapped him on the shoulder. "Want to get out of here?" I asked him. Without saying a word, he got up and started walking towards the door with me. Thankfully, no one followed us outside.
So I guess you heard by now too.
Luke asked with a half smile. "I heard parts of it," I said with a half chuckle. "You sound like a hero, man."
I'm hardly a hero, just right place at the right time.
He said as he shrugged.
I'm just glad I was there and could help.
Our leader came running up the path. We asked what was going on, and he stopped in front of us. Out of breath, he said, "Mess hall. I'll explain." We went back inside after him. He got up one of the tables, cupped his hands around his mouth, and yelled, "Hey, everyone, listen up!" The mess hall gradually simmered down. He waited to catch his breath before continuing. "A lot of you asked about what happened today on the mountain. We just heard from the hospital. Kevin is fine. He'll need back surgery, but he's stable and in good spirits." He took a breath, then went on. "Please, everyone, pay attention to your surroundings. Be cautious and safe. We're only here for a few more days. Let's make the best of them." He climbed off the table and left the mess hall. Almost immediately, the hall erupted in talks about Kevin again. Luke and I went back to the cabin and talked more about Kevin, which then evolved into answering questions about and giving tips for the upcoming school year. A little while later, the rest of the guys returned, and we all got ready for bed. Tomorrow, I would be going fishing. I was so excited for a super relaxing, chill day. The next morning, a few of us headed out to the lake with our rods, tackle, and bait. We set up our gear and cast off, then sat back and waited for a bite. All of us took turns saying what we were most excited for in junior high. A few of us had good catches. We spent all day fishing. The time just flew by. We packed up everything and made our way back to the cabin. We showed off our catches to our friends, then put them back on ice. It'd make a good dinner for sure. That night, we sat around a huge bonfire and sang together. Luke on my one side, Austin on the other. Even that SpongeBob song. We were all happy and just enjoying the night. We locked arms and sang, "Let there be peace on earth." This wasn't a Christian or religious camp or anything, but we were all from the same Catholic high school. Why we chose that song, I don't know. Maybe it was our way of praying for our injured friends. While singing, I looked around and everyone had the biggest smiles on their faces. I didn't see Luke's face, and I didn't hear him singing either. That's no big deal. Lots of people at our school weren't religious or even Christian. After a few more songs, we grabbed some marshmallows and sticks and stuck them in the fire. S'mores night was always my favorite. What could beat dessert, a nice fire, and good friends? Austin and I were engaged in a heated debate about the most effective way to get a girl's attention when I heard someone yell, "Not again," I thought. My eyes darted toward what looked like flaming arm flapping back and forth. Tyler's arm was on fire. He dropped to the ground and rolled around just like the classic phrase said. After successfully extinguishing his arm, Tyler got up and examined the damage. He had really bad burns all the way from his hands to his mid-bicep. The leaders called for an ambulance and iced his arm. Most of the guys were in shock. My mind was racing. What was going on? That night, I barely slept, and from what I could tell, that was the case for most of the guys as well. Seeing our friend's arm on fire, and then the burns, that was almost unbearable. I must have fallen asleep at some point though, because I woke up to the sound of sirens. I checked my phone. 5:17 a.m. I remember that time exactly, because what followed was impossible to forget. All of us sprinted out of our cabin and gathered between the 4 cabins on the dirt path. There was much noise and chatter and commotion. I didn't know where to look or what to think. 6 EMTs made their way by us with gurneys, heading towards the lake. We all waited and kept speculating about what was going on. After what felt like an eternity, the EMTs came back hastily with full gurneys. From the looks of it, all 3 guys were unconscious. 2 had bandages wrapped around their heads. All of them had collars around their necks. Our leaders came by shaking their heads. I'm not sure who it was, but one of them started speaking. "It looks like some of your friends decided to go for a night swim. Well, more like a night dive. They hit their heads and have to go to the hospital now." Since we'd all seen them get wheeled by, the shock value here was considerably less. Our leaders continued. "But on the brighter note, Tyler's doing well." He paused again. "So, that's where we are." He and the other leader went back to their cabin. We returned to ours too. Head injuries are serious, and things don't look too great. I climbed into bed and checked my phone. It was just before 6 a.m. when I decided to text Tyler and see how he was feeling. I didn't expect a response since it was so early, so I put my phone away and laid down. Next thing I knew, it was bright and early in the morning. I was only half awake and checked my phone. Tyler responded. He said he was feeling much better, and his arm was totally bandaged up. I asked if he wanted to talk about what happened, or if he remembered anything about it. Tyler texted me a huge paragraph afterwards. The general gist of it was the fire shot out at him. He claimed he was the same distance as all of us from the fire. There was no wind. How the fire got to him was anyone's guess. Interestingly, Tyler mentioned Luke was next to him when it happened. He remembered feeling Luke push him back before the fire shot him. If it weren't for Luke, Tyler would have had burns all over his torso and face for sure. We exchanged a few more texts before I had to run to breakfast. After the week we had, I was really looking forward to enjoying our last day of camp. I just wanted to take it easy, swimming and kayaking, 2 of my favorite activities. Back at the cabin, I changed into my swimsuit and checked my phone again. Tyler texted me a few times. The text talked about how he remembered Luke saying something like,
"Not yet,"
before he pushed him away. Not yet. What did he mean by that? What did he know? How did he know? I stopped myself. What was I thinking? This was obviously nothing. Nonetheless, I decided to text Kevin and ask if he remembered anything else about his fall. Then, I headed back out in my kayak. The sky was free of clouds. The rays of sunlight felt warm as they gradually tanned my skin. I felt so at peace on the water. I decided to paddle back to the shore after what I estimated to be 2 hours. I checked my phone again. Kevin's text flashed on my screen. His texts were rather unenlightening, with the exception of one. He mentioned that before he fell, he thought he heard a voice say something, which he thinks might have spooked him enough to knock him off balance. After digging deeper, he recalled hearing the words,
"Not yet."
I dropped my phone and froze. This was far too odd to just be a coincidence. My mind jumped from thought to thought, none of them particularly good. I tried to clear my mind and relax by cleaning myself up and grabbing some food. I couldn't stop running through the different scenarios though. After chatting with some people about unrelated things, I started to feel a bit better. I left the mess hall with some of the guys, and we all jumped in our beds to chill together one last time before heading home tomorrow. Looking down to check my phone, I saw it was after 10 p.m. already. This day really went by too fast. As much fun as I had, and as crazy as this trip was, I was excited to go back home and sleep in my own bed again. Around midnight, we all officially hit the sack. I barely thought about anything at all. Sweet dreams, here we come. Something woke me up. Was it a noise? A nightmare? No, neither. My arms and legs felt heavy, almost sunken into the bed, and I felt like I couldn't move. I could feel my heart rate accelerating as I tried to sit up, but I couldn't. I tried to open my eyes, and finally, they flipped open. Probably should have kept them closed though. There, standing over me in bed, with his big icy blue eyes piercing my soul, and his sinister grin spreading from ear to ear. You! I thought. Of course it was you! My heart was pounding through my chest as I laid there, paralyzed by fear, or something worse. After what felt like an agonizing eternity, Luke spoke. He whispered in a voice that sounded like icicles shattering on the sidewalk.
Not yet.
I watched helplessly as he reached over me and placed his hand over my chest. In that moment, it felt like an 18-wheeler slammed under my chest. I swear, my heart stopped. I shot up in bed, screaming as I opened my eyes. My heart was racing, and I was covered in sweat. I mustered some courage and looked around. I was alone. This was my room. I clawed around my bed for my phone. 3:33 a.m. I did a double take at the date, December 13th. I turned all the lights on in my room and sat up trying to figure everything out. I must have been up for hours by the time I heard my mom call up the stairs.
Ethan, breakfast.
I slowly made my way down the steps and lit up when I saw my mom in the kitchen. I raced around the counter and gave her a massive bear hug.
What in the world is that for?
She asked.
I'm not complaining about you hugging your mom, though.
I'm just so happy to see you, I blurted out.
Well, okay then. I'll take a hug for any reason,
she said, smiling. I let go and went to grab some orange juice from the fridge. As I closed the door, I noticed my mom hung some Christmas cards on there. It made me ecstatic to see my friends and their families on there. Mixed in were some funeral cards. I checked the names: Jack, Kevin, and Tyler. I started feeling lightheaded and dizzy. I sat down at the table for a second and quickly Googled my friends' names. I found the news articles right away. All three of them died in a car accident at 3 a.m. on a back road just 2 weeks ago. It was a one-car accident. No other cars involved, no survivors. Authorities think the car swerved into the median after hitting a patch of black ice while traveling at a high rate of speed. Images of the wreck were hard to look at. The whole front of the car was completely compressed and the entire car erupted in flames. My friends died and I wasn't even aware. How could this be? I got up for my second attempt at getting orange juice. Just by the ice maker, one Christmas card jumped out at me, and I froze. There in the center of the card were two icy blue eyes staring back at me. At the bottom of the card read, "Happy Holidays, from Crystal, Damien, and Luke DeMorty." I could feel my chest tighten and my pulse quicken, but I managed to string together a mumbled, Who sent this?" My mom looked at me sideways, obviously a bit confused. She then replied,
That's that guy you met at summer camp last summer, silly. He moved here just before that, and ever since, you two have been inseparable. You're trying to quiz me on your friends.
She laughed. I, however, was not laughing. I was petrified. I searched through my text, then found it. A convo with Luke that I don't recall ever starting. 9:42 p.m. yesterday, the last message I sent him. "Hey, you ready to go to the movies?" 9:44 p.m. His last message.
Not yet.
It was late at night and we were driving up to the family cottage when the first police car came up behind us on the highway. My wife didn't see it at first and she made a surprised noise before pulling over to the side of the single-lane highway. We slowly came to a stop on the gravel shoulder and the cop car sped past us, the airstream buffeting us to the side. It was going very fast, I thought, even for a cop car with its lights and siren on. After a few moments, my wife pulled back onto the road. It was odd to see a police car, or any vehicle for that matter, this late at night on the Highway 7. It was 3 o'clock in the morning, and that had been the first car we'd seen for a while. After driving for a few more minutes, she exclaimed again and pulled over quickly. This time, nearly a dozen police cars drove past. We watched them go in astonishment. What on earth would be going on to cause such a response? We live in Canada, so murders and gun crimes are fairly uncommon. My first thought was an arson, or perhaps a drug bust, but that didn't seem right for the amount of cars and the time of night. The thought of a murderer on the loose didn't even cross my mind, not at that time at least. We kept driving, and she pulled over 3 more times to let police cars go by. Each time, more than a few cops sped past at high speeds. All told, about 30 of the squad cars went by before we saw the last of them. The stereo had nothing but static for the most part, and Twitter was silent on the subject when I used the intermittent data service on my phone to check for police news in the area. It was a small community, so The local police department didn't even have a Twitter account, I noticed. By the time we got to the cottage, we were both exhausted. As I've described before, our family cabin is a long way off the beaten path. We were at the end of an isolated peninsula on a small lake. It takes about 30 minutes of driving down treacherous back roads, some of which barely qualify as even roads, to reach the quaint little shack. And that's after the 4-hour drive on freeways and single-lane highways just to get into the area. The place was so dilapidated, we told people we were going camping when we went up there, even though it was technically a cottage. We pulled into the driveway, which was just a couple of tire tracks on the grass. I got out of the car and swatted mosquitoes as I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight app. The lake was still and quiet, with only the sound of crickets and bullfrogs, and the odd coyote howl in the distance. It would be another couple of hours before the birds began to sing, and the bass began to jump out of the water, making unexpected splashing noises. I went up the rickety wooden stairs to the front door and put the key in the lock, turning it with an effort, making a mental note to put a bit of lubricant on it before the end of the weekend. Stepping inside, I backed as I felt cobwebs on my face and felt something crawling on the back of my neck. I yelped and brushed the thing off of me, feeling a spider bite the back of my neck before I could get it with my hand. I made a pained noise and said a quick prayer to Jesus, asking him to prevent infection and or give me Spider-Man abilities. I heard something move in the darkness of the cabin. We had mice, so at first I dismissed it as that, but then I took a second longer to process the sound. It had sounded larger than a mouse, whatever it was. "Hello?" I called into the cabin, my voice quivering. No one answered. I was worried momentarily that a raccoon had found its way in. It was possible, especially now that I noticed a draft coming from the back room. Maybe a window had broken from a fallen tree branch, allowing wildlife inside, I thought. There was no electricity in the cabin, since I hadn't hooked up the marine battery to the inverter yet. I used the light of my phone as I walked in further, taking slow and tentative steps. My heart beat loud and fast in my ears. My mouth and throat felt dry, and my stomach felt fluttery and strange. "Hello?" I said again, still sensing another presence inside. Something with eyes, watching, waiting. I proceeded further and almost released the contents of my overfilled bladder onto my pants when someone put their forearm around my neck, tightly choking me. I felt a cold steel blade dig into the flesh below my ear and a sting as it prodded past the superficial skin, drawing blood. Warmth trickled down the side of my neck and turned cold into the chilly night air.
"Not a sound."
The voice behind me was not asking. It was a raspy-sounding man, his smoker's voice totally devoid of emotion.
"Not a sound, or I will frigging kill you. Tell your bitch to come inside."
My wife came in, saying something about how tired she was, and then dropped what she was carrying and screamed. She stood frozen in the doorway, mosquitoes flying in past her, the car headlights making her into a silhouette, a caricature of a scared person. Her hands were up at the sides of her face and her legs shook. She tried to say something but stammered and stopped.
"I'm gonna take your car,"
the man said.
"Give me the keys."
I looked at my wife and tried to tell her to give the man the keys, but my voice didn't work. Another person was in the room. I noticed suddenly. There was a young teenage girl in the shadows, behind the couch on the floor. She rocked back and forth silently in the darkness. The knife dug further into my neck and I cried out in pain.
"The keys,"
he said again.
They're in the car.
My wife managed, her voice just above a whisper. "Your phones," he said. Again, not a question. I handed my phone to him, my only source of light. There were flashlights scattered around the cabin, but the batteries inside would be questionable at best. We would be left in utter blackness without a car, but that was the least of our concerns at that moment. My wife put her phone on the ground and kicked it over to him, after he told her to do so. He told her to move away from the door, and she came inside and stood in the kitchen. Now, we were at an impasse. He would have to let me go if he wanted to take the girl with him, the one crying in the corner. I felt a wave of sorrow from her, knowing the feeling of just 1 minute at the mercy of this terrible man, His voice was inhumane and monstrous. He took the knife away from the side of my neck quickly and stabbed it into my thigh, up to the hilt. I screamed and fell to the floor, writhing in pain, rolling back and forth. The agony was so intense I couldn't catch my breath, and felt for a moment I would lose consciousness. I stayed awake though, and felt fresh pain as the man reached down and pulled the knife out of my leg. Blood spurted high into the air and all over his face, drenching him in it. He laughed and looked down at me, his face crimson red and dripping, except for the whites of his eyes and his smiling teeth. He wiped the blade of the knife on his shirt, carefully, methodically. He didn't think about my wife, still behind him. He had called her my bitch, but he didn't know what a badass she actually is. My wife had been taking a lot of classes. Since our run-in with the locals our last time up at the cottage, she wanted to be prepared if we ran into trouble again here, and had become obsessed with self-defense and jiu-jitsu in particular. She had previously obtained a purple belt in BJJ, but was now even more dedicated, quickly progressing to a black belt in record time. She jumped up into the air and managed to get her right leg over his arm, the one that held the knife. A flying armbar is a difficult maneuver to pull off, especially against a taller opponent, but she had been practicing like it was a full-time job. I had spent many nights as her practice dummy. She wrapped her arms around the man's wrist and yanked backwards with all her body strength. She had been working out and managed to break his arm with a loud snap. I'm sure the adrenaline pumping through her veins helped maximize her torque, as I had never seen her so successful against a larger opponent. She had also caught him completely by surprise. I heard my bones crack as she pulled back even further, not relenting at just one broken bone. The man screamed and howled as his ulnar radius broke in multiple places. His shoulder popped out of socket farther and farther. I heard another loud snap, his humerus maybe. I thought we had him beat then, but just as he had been caught by surprise, so were we. The girl, who I thought was his prisoner, suddenly appeared behind my wife and pulled her off the man, screaming and swiping at her. She had a knife as well, I saw with alarm. It was smaller, but she had tightly gripped it in her fist. The light cast by my cell phone, which lay haphazardly on the floor, illuminated the scene at times, but it was mostly shrouded by darkness. I couldn't see what was happening. As I held tight pressure on my wound, I pulled off my shirt and wrapped it around my leg as a tourniquet, trying to make a futile effort to ignore my blood loss and get up to help. The man was no longer writhing on the floor. He had a furious look on his face, and his arm hung limply at his side. I was suddenly terrified as I watched him get up to his knees shakily and try to stand. He fell once, face planting with a loud smack into the wooden floor. It seemed to not affect him, though, as he just got back up to one knee again. Then, I saw him in the dim light what he was reaching for. His knife was laying on the floor, just out of his reach. He was trying to crawl over to it. In the darkness, I heard the two women fighting. It was starting to sound like my wife was getting the better of the younger girl, who was fighting like a wild woman. She had been screaming and sticking her with a tiny knife again and again, but was beginning to lose steam and slow down, her arms suddenly heavy and tired. My wife finally got a hold of her arm and twisted it backwards, dislocating the young girl's shoulder. She fell to the floor in a heap, holding her arm and making hurt animal-like noises. The man was just about to reach the knife, I realized. I shouted to my wife and told her to look out. She saw, but just a moment too late. She was going to try and kick the man in the chin as he reached for the knife, but he saw her at the last second and pulled away. She slipped on the floor, which was slick with far too much blood, as her foot missed his face and the force of her kick lifted her off her feet. She fell down hard on her shoulders and neck, but didn't stay down for long. She got up covered in blood and tried to avoid the man as he slashed at her with a knife. My wife backed up into the kitchen counter and felt around behind her for a weapon. She found one. The man came at her and lunged. She sidestepped out of the way, and he went past her, flying him all of his body weight into the kitchen counter. He looked like he had the wind knocked out of him, and was stunned for a moment. That was when my wife hit him in the back of the head with a frying pan hard. He collapsed to the floor, and the girl ran over to him, screaming at us. I managed to get up to my knee and grab my phone. I held it in the girl's eyes, blinding her with the bright light. She covered her face and cursed at me, her voice pure rage. She cradled her arm, looking defiant despite her injuries. I picked up the knife the man had dropped and managed to get up on one leg. I held onto the wall for support and told my wife we needed to go now. She agreed, and we limped out of there together. We got into the car and drove away, hearing the girl's insane voice from behind us, calling after us manically.
We're gonna find you, you know. Don't think you've won, because you ain't won shit. He's gonna wake up, and guess what? He'll be coming for you next. You ain't beat us. You ain't shit, you motherfrickers. You're gonna friggin' die. You're gonna friggin' die. You hear me?
We found out the next day, when we read the paper, just what had happened. The man was a cannibalistic serial killer, and the girl was his brainwashed accomplice and underage protege. The authorities had found human remains for multiple victims buried in his backyard, and had initiated a manhunt for him after he disappeared. That's why all the cop cars had passed us on the highway up on the way to the cottage. It was just our luck he had picked our isolated cabin at the end of a peninsula, far away from prying eyes. The chances were 1 in a million conservatively. He had been hiding there for just a few hours when we stumbled upon him. The worst part is, I know he's not dead, and he hasn't been caught. We called the police, but they managed to get away before they could get there. They are both trained hunters and survivalists, I found out since, so they know how to get by in the wild. I only hope the police manage to catch them before they can find us. I'm worried because I know there's a few things in the cabin that could have identified us. A fire permit which bore my mother's name hung from a board on the living room. The police say it wasn't there when they checked the cabin. I got a new security system and additional locks on my doors, but I don't know if we can prevent the inevitable. It might be time I started taking jiu-jitsu classes with my wife. It was a beautiful fall morning as we drove through the small towns and rural communities dotting Nova Scotia. We weren't locals to the area, but we had heard of some great camping areas in the vast forest around the province, and it was the first time our friend group got together for a trip in almost 10 years, so we wanted to make it a good one. We had driven from the city to go on a camping trip, 7 of us in 2 vehicles. As we drove through the rural countryside, Dylan, the eldest of the group, spoke up.
It's nothing like Toronto, is it, guys?
We all agreed. It was nothing like Ontario for that matter. The Nova Scotia countryside was breathtaking, full of personality and culture. As Matt May's tall trees blared over the radio, we were growing increasingly excited for the next few nights we'd spend in the woods. Richie was sitting in the back of my crew cab Silverado sipping on a Molson Canadian and singing along to the radio. I hadn't seen him in such a good mood in years. He seemed to be finally getting over his divorce and enjoying himself for once. Richie and I were childhood friends, and after his wife left him, we were roommates in the city. We were like brothers. I'd seen the man suffer so badly, and it was good to see him smile for once. Dylan's girlfriend, Erica, was up front with me, sleeping with a seat slightly back, and Dylan sat in the back drinking beers with Richie. Dylan was a skilled hiker and outdoorsman like myself, but Erica was not so much. This was only her 2nd or 3rd time in the deep woods, but she really loved it. "Soon time for a piss break?" Richie piped up.
Soon time for a piss break?
Maybe if you didn't start drinking beers before we even hit the highway, you wouldn't need a piss every 5 minutes.
Dylan chuckled. "Alright, screw it. Give the others a shout and tell them we're pulling over at the next dirt road," I said. I needed to stretch my legs anyways. It was a long drive and my back was starting to hurt. We called the rest of the group and pulled over. As we pulled off onto a dirt road and piled out of the truck and others came in close behind in their Jeep Wrangler, the door swung open and out came Mary Ann, Elizabeth, and Robert. Mary Ann and Elizabeth were best friends. Even after these years of knowing them, I couldn't believe how beautiful they were. They looked like 2 supermodels. Robert was from BC, and we'd only met him a couple years back. But he fit in with us so fast, it was like he was always there. "How's everyone doing?" Robert said, with a large grin across his face. He was what you'd call a hippie, and always brought a boatload of psychedelics on our camping trips. He lit up a large joint and began passing it around. I spoke up. "We're good, man. Erica's still sleeping in the truck. How are you guys?" "Great!" he exclaimed. "Frickin' great, man!" I could tell from the look on his face, he'd already gotten into the sheet of blotter acid in his backpack. As the others chatted, I went with Richie to check the dump of the truck to make sure we all had our supplies. 2 giant coolers full of food and drinks, fire starting gear, axes, knives, first aid kits, tools, and bear spray. It was all there. We glanced around to make sure no one could see us from the road, and Richie and I pulled out the 2 guns we'd taken with us, an SKS rifle with about 60 rounds of ammunition, and a 12-gauge pump-action Mossberg with about 25 rounds of buckshot. The last time we'd been camping, we had a close encounter with a bear and nothing to defend ourselves with, so this time we made sure we did. You can never be too safe in the forest around here. We checked the maps. We were getting pretty close. Only another hour or so, and we'd be driving into the woods. Then, it was a day's hike, and we'd be at our chosen campground, a decent-sized clearing in the woods next to a freshwater lake. We'd planned to stay for a couple of days and hike back out. We'd had plenty of supplies. The rest of the trip went by pretty fast, and before we knew it, we were loading up our equipment and walking. We'd spent most of the day hiking through the woods, stopping for smoke breaks and once to eat. I checked the GPS, and we were getting nearer to our final destination. Some of the group noticed things in the woods along the way. They looked like small native totems, dolls, carvings, odds and ends, hanging from the trees. This must have been a native hunting ground or something, we figured. We left the totems and ornaments where we found them. As we came upon the clearing, the sun was just beginning to set. We set up our camp, and we were preparing for our first night there. We turned on some music on the battery-powered stereo that Dylan brought, cooked up a barbecue over an open fire, and started to really get into the beers. Robert pulled out the sheet of blotter acid, and we all took a hit. We spent the rest of our evening and nights sitting around the fire, listening to music, drinking, and smoking, and laughing like maniacs at the tricks the LSD played on our brains. Little did we know, all of the noise we were making attracted something none of us had ever seen before. I retreated to my tent with Richie, Elizabeth, and Mary Ann, while the others went to Dylan's tent. Mary Ann and Elizabeth looked at me, and Richie and Mary Ann said,
"I think I know a way to help you get over that ex-wife of yours, Richie,"
with a huge grin plastered across her face. Elizabeth came over to me and leaned closer, and we started kissing. Richie and Mary Ann had done the same. Just as things were starting to heat up in the tent, we heard a scream from the other one. It sounded like Erica. The other tent was pegged up closer to the woods, while we pegged up down near the lake, about 100 meters apart. Richie and I hopped up, and both of our eyes fixated on the guns in the corner. We had them both. The other tent was supposed to have one. Shit. We grabbed the guns and told the girls to stay put, and we hastily loaded them while running towards the other tent. We heard Erica scream again, and by the time we got there, everyone was outside. We all had our flashlights on. "What's going on? What's wrong?" I yelled. Erica was in tears near the tent, holding on to Dylan for dear life. She was muttering something about the animal in the woods. We finally managed to get her to calm down enough to tell us what was wrong. She stammered on.
I got up to pee, and when I did, it was behind the tree, and it touched my shoulder."
"What was behind the tree, Erica?" Dylan said, firmly, but calmly.
"I don't freaking know."
She yelled.
"It was tall and bony, and it had really long claws. It was covered in blood."
I pulled Robert aside. "Man, how much frickin' acid did you give her?" None, man," Robert said nervously. "She didn't want any." "Was she asleep before this?" I asked. "Yeah, I think so," Robert said. "She must have been dreaming or some shit, man. Here, take the shotgun anyway, calm her down, and..." Then we heard it. Elizabeth and Mary Ann screamed, but it wasn't the same. It stopped abruptly. We knew right away something was wrong. A sense of terror washed over all of us. The adrenaline kicked in, and Robert and I ran for the tent. But when we did, it was torn into pieces. When we looked inside, so were the girls. I felt something sour crawl up from my stomach and into my mouth as I looked upon the mangled woman that were lying before us. Elizabeth was still alive and was begging me to help her. The helpless look on her eyes shot through me as I noticed both of her legs were missing and her insides were hanging out. Mary Ann was missing an arm and her head and was almost torn clean in two vertically. I turned and looked at Robert, and all I seen was shock in his eyes. I turned around and vomited. Robert couldn't look away. We yelled for the first aid kit and the rest of the group came running. We sat and held Elizabeth's hand as she was begging us not to let her die. Erica, who was a registered nurse, ran up, but once she seen the extent of the wounds, her hand shot over her mouth and she dropped the first aid kit. After a moment, she collected herself and began giving first aid while looking at the rest of us hopelessly. Within 5 minutes, Elizabeth was dead. Richie began to yell through his tears.
Shit! Shit! What the hell happened to them?
We all began to talk to one another in a panicked confusion. Dylan hadn't said a word.
Enough!
He yelled, and again louder.
Enough!
Everyone went silent.
It looks like a bear maybe got into the tent. It's probably still around. We need to hunker down at the other tent and wait till daylight. It's our only hope.
We've been checking our phones, but we lost service hours ago. We were cut off. We took the rest of our supplies and ran back to the other tent. As we did, we heard a horrible screeching in the woods. It sounded almost human, but way too animalistic, too loud and shrill. "Oh man, it's a frickin' Wendigo!" Robert blurted out. "My grandfather told me about them. They eat people in the woods, and it's coming to frickin' kill us!" Richie blurted out.
It's a friggin' bear or something, not an urban legend. And if it comes anywhere near us, we're gonna shoot it dead.
He snatched the shotgun out of Robert's hand and walked over to light a fire. "We'll be able to see it better if we got lots of light on the woods." Wherever it was watching us and patiently waiting. We could hear it go back up to the other tent and drag something out. The bodies. The poor girls. The woods grew eerily cold and quiet. We sat there around the fire with our guns trained on the woods. I had the SKS rifle in my hand fully loaded, and Richie had the shotgun. It was moving around us, and we could almost catch glimpses with our flashlights, but it was much too fast. Branches snapped as the monster stalked around us, growling and snarling. The rest of the crew pulled out the axes and knives and stayed behind us. With all of our backs to the lake, silence. The silence went on for what felt like an eternity. Then we heard it. Elizabeth's voice. "Help me, please! Richie, Sam, Robert, someone, help me!" It didn't sound natural, but it sounded like her. But in a way, it didn't.
This is impossible. We watched her die.
Dylan yelled.
How is she still alive?
He took off for the woods, in the direction of her voice. I couldn't grab him, and he ignored our pleas to come back.
I'm going to get Elizabeth. She's still alive.
Those were his final words. We shone our flashlights on him as he went past the tree line, and that's when we saw it. A large, pale gray creature lunged forward. It had lifeless eyes, long, mottled, black and gray hair, and long, slender claws which it dug into Dylan's flesh. It must have been 8 feet tall at least. Its long, gnarled teeth showed as it screamed in Dylan's face before tearing into his throat. All we could do was watch in horror. Dylan fell to his knees as the creature began ravaging him, tearing him into pieces. It looked like a large, emaciated humanoid, but it appeared to have incredible strength. Richie and I opened fire as soon as we realized Dylan was dead, and there was no saving him. The bullets tore through its flesh, but it did not react. Instead, it pulled Dylan's mangled corpse into the woods as it took off running, letting out loud screeches as it ran, breaking limbs off of trees like toothpicks. Richie and I both emptied our weapons into the beast, and it didn't even faze it. Erica was crying hysterically. Richie and I reloaded as fast as we could. We heard a horrible crunching sound in the trees, like a dog eating a ham bone. We all looked at each other in shock and horror. It must have been getting closer to daylight. The creature didn't seem to like light, as it would periodically throughout the night come and watch us, screech at us in the woods, but never come close to the firelight. It also fled from our flashlights. We all thought that as long as we kept the fire going, we would survive until daylight. If the creature fled from sun, we would make our escape. That's when it started to rain. We began throwing things onto the fire frantically, trying to keep the light alive, but the fire grew more and more dull as the rain beat down harder. The creature was inching closer as the light died. It evaded our flashlights with incredible speed and came almost within striking range. It was so close I could smell it now. The smell of rotting flesh. You could see its black teeth in its rotting mouth, the veins standing out against its gray skin, the rotting flesh at the end of its claws, as it began grabbing at us, trying to pull us away. Richie and I opened fire directly at the monster, and it began to screech in pain and stumble backwards, only to regain its footing and lunge forward again. Just as we both emptied our magazines, Robert yelled, "Get down!" I looked over my shoulder and seen him brandishing a flare gun. Genius. It hates light. If we stick a flare in its flesh, it might just flee. But Robert done even better than that. He fired a bright ball of white phosphorus directly into the monster's screeching mouth. It flailed around horrendously as the flare burned away inside its mouth. It gave Richie and me enough time to reload and begin firing on it again. We were on the last of our ammo now, and if it didn't die, we were screwed. Robert loaded another flare and let it fly into the monster. This one stuck into its chest and it fell down. We swarmed it with whatever weapons we had left. Richie and I opened fire until we had nothing left as well, while the rest of the group jumped on it with knives and axes. It let out its last awful squelch as Erica drove a large splitting axe into its head. We retreated back to the camp, watching the monster cautiously, fearing it may jump back up and charge at any minute. We sat there not saying a word until the sun came up. As the rain subsided and the sun cleared through, we immediately left the camp with everything left behind and made for our vehicles. By the time we escaped the woods, we were completely exhausted, and as the shock subsided, we began to sob and try to make sense of what had happened in those woods. We decided that it would be best if we told everyone a grizzly bear had gotten our friends. No one would believe the true story anyway, and during the funerals, we vowed to never speak of it again. I don't speak to my old friends much these days. We mostly went our separate ways after the incident. The only one I did speak to was Richie, but he committed suicide about a year after it happened. With the very same shotgun he held his ground with on that dreadful night. And on nights where I can't drink the image out of my mind, it comes to me in my dreams, screeching rapidly, flailing, and ready to kill. Thanks for listening, Wolfpack. If you want to submit your own story, the links for my email and subreddit will be down below. I've also created a Discord, so if you want to join that, the link will be in the description down below as well. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And with that said, have beautiful nightmares, and I will see you next time.